Hello, everybody. I am John Allen, and this is Last Week in the Church. As you know, this is the show where we kind of raid the fridge of professional Vatican journalism. We take out some leftovers, slather on our Crux brand secret sauce, and serve it up piping hot. Here's what we've got for you this week. We begin with Hungary. Pope Francis, over the weekend, took a 3-day visit to Hungary. It was the 41st foreign trip of his papacy, and his second to Hungary within 2 years. We're going to have a complete breakdown. We will begin with the obligatory checkup on papal health. Spoiler alert, he seems basically fine, but we'll have more to say than that. And then we're also going to take a look at 3 members of the Pope's supporting cast this weekend. That is, 3 personalities who shared the stage with Pope Francis because each illustrates one of the important storylines of this trip. The supporting cast is composed of Prime Minister Viktor Orbán of Hungary, Russian Orthodox Metropolitan Hilarion, and the Pope's ostensible host this weekend, Cardinal Péter Erdő of Budapest, who is not only the leader of the Catholic Church in Hungary, but is actually on a lot of short lists right now to one day become Pope himself, maybe be Francis's successor. So we'll take a look at the significance of all of that. Next up, we've got a watershed for women. Pope Francis changes the rules for the Synod of Bishops to allow for a slew of lay people, including women, to not only take part, but to be full members of the Synod, therefore with full voting rights. This is a historical novelty, and we're going to explain the importance of it all. We'll also take a look at a couple of other personnel moves this past week with regard to women, which may force some critics of Pope Francis to do at least a kind of minor, partial, half-hearted rethink. Then finally, we will pose the provocative question, does Pope Francis hear Time's winged chariot hurrying near? A new interview provides at least a partial answer to that enigmatic half-joke. And yes, if you're a conoscente, that is a Simpsons reference. All that and more is waiting for you this week on Last Week in the Church, so please stick around. All right, everybody, happy Tuesday to you. Happy Tuesday, May 2nd, 2023. Now, if you watch this show on a regular basis, you know, although the show is released on Tuesdays, we actually film it on Mondays. So as I am speaking to you, it is Monday, May 1st, which here in Italy is actually a national holiday. This is the Festa dei Lavoratori, literally the Festival of Workers. Basically, it's the Italian equivalent of Labor Day, and yes, I am aware of the irony that on a day when workers are supposed to have the day off, here we are nevertheless working. But look, folks, the good news is this isn't labor for me. This is a labor of love. I absolutely dig bringing this show to you. It is a complete gas. And so let's get started. As we mentioned at the top, Pope Francis, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, was in Hungary for his second trip there in 2 years. He was in Hungary for 2021 to close a Eucharistic Congress. This was an official state visit. Now, of course, this is the first big outing for the Pope after his health scare in March, when he was rushed to the hospital, Rome's Gemelli Hospital, which is the traditional place where popes with health problems go. And he spent 3 nights there dealing with a severe pulmonary infection that resulted in a case of bronchitis. And so, obviously, one of the storylines this weekend is, how was the Pope doing? And bear in mind, even though this was just a brief 3-day trip, it was kind of intense. I added it up. He actually had 14 events on his schedule. That's almost 5 per day. And, you know, for an 86-year-old man who was missing part of one lung, who had colon surgery a couple of years ago, who struggles with a painful case of sciatica, the nerve condition, also has chronic problems with his knees, you know, all of that, it was an arduous undertaking. And the bottom line, is that, by all accounts, the Pope did extremely well. He conducted most of his public events seated in a wheelchair. That's how he would arrive and exit. But on Friday, the first day of the trip, he actually walked under his own power a fair bit, including descending the steps of the cathedral in Budapest on his own. During his public speeches, his voice was strong. He seemed alert and engaged. He went off the cuff at several points. And in general, it seemed a kind of bravura performance for Francis, even though by the end he did seem a bit taxed. But then, frankly, if I had done everything the Pope had done over those 3 days, I would have been a little taxed at the end too. So fundamentally, I think a resounding thumbs up on the Pope's physical condition. Now, I should note that in the customary in-flight press conference on the way home, Pope Francis took a question about his health. Now, the question really wasn't intended to find out how he was doing, because really the 3 days in Hungary had already answered that question. Really, what it was intended to do was to get him to admit that the Vatican had lied about what happened when he was rushed to the hospital on March 29th. You may remember it was a Wednesday. It was the day of the Pope's general audience. Late that evening, Rome time, we got a news bulletin from the Vatican, totally out of a clear blue sky, saying that the Pope had been taken to the Gemelli Hospital for what was described sort of routine, pre-planned checkups. Now, it later emerged that there was nothing particularly routine or pre-planned about this, that in fact, the Pope had experienced respiratory difficulties and had to be taken to the hospital pretty quickly in order to begin an IV and other treatment in order to get him out of the woods. Pope Francis admitted as much not long ago. He made a phone call to an Italian friend where he said that if he'd gotten to the Gemelli any later, he said, I might not be standing here talking to you. So, obviously we know it was something serious. The Pope didn't quite bite on the question, and he didn't quite say that the Vatican had misrepresented the seriousness of the situation. He simply said that that day, the 29th, he was feeling poorly after his general audience. He skipped lunch. He went to lay down. A doctor who came to check on him decided he needed to go to the hospital immediately, and so that was that. Now look, folks, here's the thing. There is a grand tradition of the Vatican, maybe lying is too strong a word, but certainly playing down or seeking to minimize threats to the Pope's health. Let me give you a famous case in point. In 1914, August 1914, an Italian newspaper had carried a story one day basically saying that Pope Pius X seemed to have a cold. In response, L'Osservatore Romano, the official Vatican newspaper, published a bristling editorial, the gist of which was, how dare you suggest that there is any problem with the Pope's health? You were trying to sabotage and undercut the papacy, and, this is just completely untoward. The next day, Pope Pius X was dead. Okay, so look, I get it, and it is possible just to say about all this was just the Vatican being the Vatican. The problem is, when the Vatican basically misrepresents the Pope's health situation and gets caught out doing it, as in this instance, it undercuts their credibility on everything, right? I mean, the average person probably would draw the conclusion that if the Vatican is not going to tell the truth about this, how can we trust them on anything else? So, and by the way, do not blame the Vatican spokesperson, Italian layman Matteo Bruni, for this, even though he's the one who issued the statement, because Bruni, just all he knows is what he's told from people higher up the food chain. So, memo to the movers and shakers in the Vatican, you have nothing to lose by telling the truth about stuff like this. The truth is going to come out anyway, in part because your boss is going to tell people. There is a clear pattern here of Pope Francis just, opening up and telling people what's going on, regardless of whatever official spin the powers that be may want to put on it. So, look, there is nothing to gain, everything to lose. Just tell us the truth. That's the conclusion. All right, now, in terms of the Pope's supporting cast from this past weekend, as I mentioned, there were sort of three key figures who shared the stage with Francis. Let's begin with Prime Minister Viktor Orbán of Hungary. Now, in many ways, we all know that Orbán is not exactly Pope Francis's cup of tea, right? I mean, when Francis talks about trends in politics he does not like, almost always he begins and ends with right-wing nationalist populism. Well, what is Viktor Orbán other than a right-wing nationalist populist, right? I mean, he's sort of the Pope's bête noire. And the divisions between Francis and Orbán were, in many ways, on clear display this weekend, even though neither man seemed anxious to make a big deal out of their differences. I mean, it is unavoidable, the conclusion, that in some ways Orbán and Francis represent differing, if not competing, versions of Christianity. Orbán, who is a Calvinist by formation, represents a Christianity that is premised on identity, tradition, family values. Francis, on the other hand, represents a Christianity that is premised on openness, dialogue, and the social gospel. Sunday morning, when Pope Francis celebrated Mass, coincidentally in a square right in front of the Hungarian Parliament building that is so dominated by Orbán and his allies, he used the word doors 10 times. In Italian, it's porte, doors. Always to emphasize that doors must be open. Now, this is a clear contrast to the hard-line position of the Orbán government on immigration. And so, clearly, the gauntlet had, in a certain sense, been flung down. Yet, the interesting thing about all of this is that, nevertheless, Orbán rolled out the red carpet for Francis during his 3 days in town, and Francis himself took great pains to show respect and deference and openness to the Orbán government. And this is because, well, to begin with, the two men, despite their vast differences on many fronts, do in some ways see eye to eye on Ukraine. Both believe that it is a mistake to isolate Russia. They want to keep lines of communication with Moscow and Putin open. Both have great sympathy for the Ukrainian victims of the conflict. Hungary has opened its doors to Ukrainian refugees. And both, however, are also not seen as reliable allies of the Western powers. I don't think Joe Biden or, 10 Downing Street would look at either Orbán or Pope Francis as somebody they can automatically count on as part of their echo chamber. So you can think of this as, in a way, kind of Pope Francis's version of Ostpolitik, right? I mean, during the Cold War, the Vatican tried to reach out to the Soviet sphere under Paul VI and Cardinal Casaroli to engage them despite their differences. Today, Pope Francis seems to be trying to engage this nationalist populist tide, even though he clearly doesn't drink from the same well. All right, so that was one point of interest during this trip. The kind of odd couple dialogue going on between Francis and his bête noire. All right, secondly, there was the fact that while he was in Hungary, Pope Francis also scheduled an unannounced meeting with Metropolitan Hilarion, Russian Orthodox Metropolitan Hilarion, formerly the number 2 official in the Russian Orthodox power structure. Now he is the Metropolitan of Budapest in Hungary for the Russian Orthodox. This was taken as another sign of the Pope's desire to keep these lines of communication with Russia, both with the Kremlin and with the Russian Orthodox Church, open. And it's worth noting that in that airborne press conference on the way back to Rome, Francis also hinted that there is some kind of secret Vatican mission to Russia in the works. Didn't provide any details, but said that when it's time, he'll announce it. And it stressed over and over again the importance of openness, of keeping lines of communication open. Hilarion also attended Pope Francis's Mass on Sunday, and so clearly the symbolism here was a pope who, despite his clear sympathy, his clear, deep concern for the victims of the war in Ukraine, nevertheless does not want to paint Russia into a corner, but is interested in trying to find some kind of negotiated exit strategy to this conflict. And that then finally brings us to Cardinal Péter Erdő of Budapest, who, as I mentioned, was the Pope's official host this weekend, although you really wouldn't know that from most media coverage. I mean, Erdő He did deliver a greeting to Pope Francis at that Sunday Mass, but he was otherwise pretty much invisible. I mean, he didn't really say anything, didn't really do anything. And this is in keeping with Erdo's overall ethos, which is he is a strong behind-the-scenes figure, somebody deeply respected, former president of the European Bishops' Conference, elected to 2 terms in that post, but in public, very much a quiet, gray sort of figure who tends to stay out of the spotlight and avoid controversy. Now, under other circumstances, you might think, well, that doesn't exactly recommend him to be pope, right? I mean, like, a pope is by definition a public figure. You want somebody who can inspire, who can engage, who can be relevant, who can move the tides of history. But here's the thing. I think there may be sort of analogy here, in a weird way, between Erdo and the politics of the next papacy and, say, Joe Biden in the United States and American politics. I mean, prior to 2020, what was the book on Joe Biden? The book on Joe Biden was, look, he may be a really effective legislator, but he is a terrible candidate, right? Completely uncharismatic, given to this kind of meandering public oratory that doesn't really turn anybody on in any dramatic way. So conventional as to be basically invisible, right? I mean, he had run for the presidency in 98 and in 2008, both cases. I mean, he was an also-ran. And then Donald Trump happened, right? And after the 4 turbulent, divisive, wild years of the Trump papacy, although he probably thinks of himself as a pope, the Trump presidency, suddenly Americans were in the mood for somber and serious and, no drama, right? Well, in a similar way, it may well be that many of the cardinals who are going to take part in the conclave to elect the next pope, after the divisive, turbulent, difficult years of the Francis papacy, may be in the mood for something a little less dramatic, and Erdo might well fit the bill. And, we should say there are many other qualities about Erdo that might recommend him. Number 1, he is, by training and disposition, a canon lawyer, by all accounts, a very good canon lawyer. After all the legal reforms of the Francis years, maybe having a pope who could consolidate and rationalize all of that would be seen as a positive quality. Number 2, he speaks 7 languages. I mean, he can communicate with people from all around the world in their own languages. By the way, those languages include both English and Russian. He actually studied at the University of California in Berkeley at one point during his career, so he knows the United States. He is also somebody who has a deep relationship with the Orthodox churches, the Eastern churches, particularly the Russian Orthodox. And despite the fact that he is seen as more conservative than liberal, he is also seen as fundamentally a pragmatist. He was the relator, a kind of presiding bishop at the 2 tumultuous synods for the family in 2014, 2015, and got high marks for trying to do justice both to positions of the conservatives and the progressives in those 2 events. So for all kinds of reasons, Peter Erdo may be somebody worth keeping your eye on, even though he's not the kind of guy who in full public view is going to, turn the world on with his smile. He nevertheless is an interesting figure, well worth keeping in the back of your minds. All right, we move on then to a watershed for women. Now, if you've been paying attention, you know that the debate over women in the Catholic Church often focuses on the issue of women priests, right? And the argument sort of boils down like this. Those who want to see women priests will say, look, the ban on women priests is about keeping women out of power in the church. Supporters of tradition will say, no, that's not true. The priesthood is about service, not power. If you want to empower women, there are plenty of ways to do that other than making them priests. To which the supporters of women's ordination will say, oh yeah? Like what? Well, Pope Francis provided a sort of partial answer to that like what question this past week when he revised the rules for the Synod of Bishops. This is the summit of bishops and other participants from all around the world that goes back to the immediate Vatican II era. It was created by Pope Paul VI. and it's supposed to be a sounding board for popes about issues of global interest. The next synod will be this coming October. It is a synod on synodality, trying to come up with a more synodal church. In other words, a more listening church, a more dialogical church, one in which there is kind of shared decision-making. And it now emerges that in this next synod, it will unfold with a new set of rules which allow for lay people, including women, to be full voting members. It used to be in the past, you had bishops and other clergy who were the voting members. And by clergy, I mean men, right? Priests, religious, brothers, deacons, but men, right? Who were the ones casting votes. And then you had what were called auditors, meaning other participants who can speak and listen and take part, but they don't get votes. Now that's all been done away with. And instead of those auditors, there's going to be a group of basically 70 non-bishop participants, and half of them are going to be women. A certain share of them, 20 of the 70, will come from the Eastern churches. Basically, if you do the math, what it means is that at least 40 of the participants in the next synod are going to be women. Now, going from 0 to 40, a minimum of 40, and it may be more depending on who the Pope decides to appoint in the end, that is a significant change. Now, critics will tell you, so what? The Synod of Bishops is basically a talk shop. It doesn't have any actual power. It's merely an advisory body, and at the end of the day, the Pope still makes all the decisions. Well, that's true. But nevertheless, the Synod is the closest thing we have to a legislative branch in the Catholic Church. It's a way to take the temperature of the opinion of the global church, and the fact that there will now be women not just lending their voices, but also lending their votes to that process. It is significant. Now, another thing that critics will say, right, and this is somewhat cynical, but, hell, I'm a journalist. Cynicism is kind of what we do, right? So, what cynical critics will say is that Pope Francis isn't really trying to empower women here. What he's actually trying to do is empower people who agree with him. That this is about stacking the deck with like-minded allies who will rubber stamp the conclusions that the Pope wants the Synod to reach, okay? Now, look, we don't even know, officially speaking, what the lineup for this Synod is going to be, so we're going to have to withhold judgment on that front. But I do want to note that there were some other personnel moves this past week, which, at least in a small way, raised some questions about that cynical reading of things. So this past week, on April 25th, the Pope announced new appointments as members and consultors to the Vatican's Dicastery for Evangelization. This is the department of the Vatican that basically is responsible for the church in missionary territory, traditionally speaking, pretty much the developing world, right? Now, there were a couple of very interesting female appointments as new members of the Dicastery for Evangelization. One is a name that may not mean much outside of Italy, but certainly inside Italy is a known quantity. That's Marta Cartabia. Marta Cartabia is the former president of Italy's Constitutional Court and the country's former Minister of Justice under the government of former Prime Minister Mario Draghi. She's responsible for a sweeping overhaul of the country's system of criminal and civil justice known as La Riforma Cartabia. And here's what's interesting. She is also historically very close to a Catholic movement called Comunione e Liberazione, Communion and Liberation, which has its roots in Milan and is basically seen as quite conservative. Cartabia, for instance, is an outspoken opponent of gay marriage, believes that the state should recognize as marriage only a relationship between a man and a woman, and other relationships could be regularized in other forms, but they shouldn't be called marriage, okay? Now, another woman Pope Francis appointed was Marta Ascension Romero, who is part of the leadership team of the Neo-Catechumenal Way, which is another new movement in Catholicism, often seen as fairly conservative. The point I am trying to make is that at least in the case of these two women who have now been empowered, in a sense, by a papal decision to make them members, not just consultants, but members, that is, with rights to vote, of a Vatican department, they aren't exactly the cookie-cutter mold of reliable Pope Francis allies. So at least in these two admittedly small, but nonetheless symbolically significant ways, you can't really make the argument that the Pope is just appointing people who have already drunk the Kool-Aid. All right? Finally, this week, is Pope Francis hearing time's winged chariot hurrying near? That is, does he have a sense of limited time? Well, look, he just gave an interview to the Argentine newspaper La Nación. 3 points of interest out of that interview. 1, on the subject of German Archbishop Georg Gänswein, the longtime priest secretary to Pope Benedict XVI, who has become seen as a kind of critic of the Francis papacy because of a book he put out after the death of Benedict, and also a series of media interviews in which he sort of highlighted differences between Benedict and Francis. Francis was asked what's going to happen to Gänswein, and Francis said, well, I've given Gänswein the choice of either staying in Italy or going back to Germany, but in any event, he needs to get out of the Vatican. And the journalist who conducted this interview added that it was clear from what Pope Francis was saying that the era of Gänswein as an influential figure in the Vatican scene is over. Okay? That's point number 1. Point number 2, Pope Francis once again came to the defense of his predecessor, Pope John Paul II, whose reputation was recently called into question by the brother of the Vatican girl, that is, the girl, 15-year-old daughter of a minor Vatican employee who went missing in 1983 by the name of Emanuela Orlandi. There's now a Vatican and a parliamentary investigation in Italy of that disappearance. Her brother recently went on Italian television to play a tape of an ex-Roman mobster who alleged that John Paul had connived in a pedophile ring inside the Vatican, that maybe Emanuela Orlandi had been killed to cover it up. That produced a strong defense from Pope Francis, first in a Regina Coeli address last Sunday, and then, or 2 Sundays ago rather, and then a comment in this interview where he said that John Paul is a saint, no one can honestly doubt his decency. Third point in this interview had to do with Pope Francis going back to Argentina. He said he is planning to go back next year, 2024. It would be his first homecoming since his election more than a decade ago. Now, what do these things have in common? Well, the Gänswein thing is interesting in that, well, you know, popes have every right to send people packing if they don't care for them. It doesn't normally play out in full public view like this, which may suggest that Francis's patience with his perceived critics is running a bit thin. On John Paul II, one pope defending another. Again, no novelty, but it may be that after more than a decade in office, Pope Francis is now especially sensitive to the way that a pope's legacy, a pope's memory, could be distorted or misrepresented, particularly once he's no longer around to defend himself. And in Argentina, why now? Why would the Pope now be saying, okay, I'm finally going to commit to going home? I mean, in theory, it's because he wants to go at a time when he won't be sucked into Argentinian politics. But once again, it may also be that he is newly aware that his physical capacity to make a demanding overseas trip, an intercontinental trip like this, may not last much longer. And if he's ever going to do it, he may have to do it now. So what we have here is a new optic for understanding what Pope Francis says and does, one having to do with a sense of limited time. To be clear, the Pope could have said all of these 3 things at any point in his papacy, but at this point, on the back of a health scare, it is at least worth pondering whether a sense of limited time may be creating a new sense of urgency on the part of Pope Francis, and also a new perspective for making sense of the challenges he faces. Okay, as ever, you can find full coverage of all of these stories on the Crux site. That is cruxnow.com, cruxnow.com. While you are on the site, if you are of a humor, we would appreciate it if you could make a small financial contribution. There is a handy-dandy box there. You can, give us whatever spare change you can afford. maybe what you would spend this month on streaming a movie or buying a meal, I don't know. But whatever it is, we love bringing you this show, and we love bringing you the news on the Crux site, but we can't do it for free. We can't do it on the cheap. We need your support to make that possible. We will be back here next week, same bat time, same bat channel. In the meantime, have a fantastic and blessed week. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we will talk to you very soon.